everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today, we are joined by our distinguished guest, Tanya Luhrmann. Tanya is an anthropologist and professor at Stanford University, known for her research on the intersection of psychology, anthropology, and religion. Tanya is especially recognized for her studies on how people experience God, spirits, and invisible others. She has authored several books, including How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. And it's an excellent book. This session is part of a wider series at the Stoa called The Entity Pill, where we're exploring the phenomenon of disincarnate entities from various different perspectives and disciplines. And this book definitely complements the series quite well. And how today is going to work, I'm going to warm up Tanya with some questions, and then we'll have hopefully get a high-level overview of the concepts and arguments in the books, and then we can engage in more explorative questions in the Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, pop them in the chat, and I'll call you when we're at the Q&A portion. So that being said, Tanya, welcome to the Stoa.
It's a pleasure to be here. Who is here?
Many people across the world are here. The Stoa is a very eclectic international place.
I should say the puppies may be on the verge of being picked up for camp, so we'll have to step aside for a moment.
Okay.
I just want to let you know that will be a brief interruption.
Okay, very cool. And like I mentioned, I'd like to unpack some of the main concepts and arguments of the book, starting with perhaps real making and the faith frame. And here's a quote from a passage of your book. Still here? Yeah. People do not, in fact, behave as if gods and spirits are real in the way that everyday objects are. And then you go on to say a sustained commitment to the reality of invisible others is needed. Something that you call the faith frame. So what are invisible others, and what is the faith frame exactly?
So the idea of the faith frame came out of the observation that people don't, really treat what an observer might call a belief in gods and spirits as like believing in tables and chairs. They just treat it differently, and often they can tell you that their God can do anything, but they never ask God to feed the dog or to put their dog on the bus for camp. They never, they call a mechanic when the car breaks down. And people of faith who are Christians, tell you constantly that they don't believe enough. It's from an insider's perspective, the experience of faith, particularly when the spirit in question comes with many offers, like the Christian God comes with great potency, comes with great love, comes with great offers, and the ordinary human's life is full of unlovely stuff. So there's a kind of disjuncture between what seem to be these devout faith commitments to God and these and people's behavior. And so I use the faith frame to distinguish between the kind of commitments people have, their sense that let's put it over here, the faith sense that they have the ideas they have about gods and spirits. And I point out that the more powerful and kinder and all loving those gods and spirits are, the harder it is to really make them as real as in your life as ordinary physical reality. You need to work. And so then I tell a story about kindling, the way people pay attention to give themselves a more visceral sense that the God and spirit is there and cares about them and is involved with their life. I mean, the kind of thing that people of faith say to me is they want to be praying all the time. They want to be thinking about their God all the time. They want to be involved with their contacts all the time. And they're just not. They forget. It becomes tough. So the book lays out, okay, well, what do people do? What have I seen over the last few decades of my work? What have I seen about the features of spiritual practice that help people come to experience spirits in the broad sense, things that tend to be immaterial, things that tend to be invisible, things that tend to be harder to believe in. How do people come to, what do I know about the practices that people use to make these hard to grasp things feel intimate and viscerally present? And I have, like, 6 kinds of things I say about that.
And I think one of the chapters you talk about the importance of practice and training, which you're just gesturing at, how it helps with reel making, and then the kindled experience, where certain experiences serve as evidence for a person's belief. Could you speak more about kindling and what kinds of practices are needed for that?
So I start with the idea that just, a narrative richness is really helpful, what I call a paracosm. So if you have a set of ideas about spirits, and, if you have a sort of a shared imaginative frame, that's the phrase I use for the paracosm. And in that imaginative frame with lots of details, the more details help you to make the experience your own. So I'm guessing that you've got some Tolkien readers out there. I myself was a Tolkien geek. And, the fact that the stories are so, that you can remember that Sam brought his cooking gear with him to the edge of Mordor. It's easier to smell that rabbit. And if you can smell that rabbit, you're more likely to kind of, it feels like it's more present. So I start with the idea of a paracosm and the richly detailed story in which this has to unfold. And I point out that in the paracosm, there are usually rules for expectations for how you know if God's shown up, how you interact with God, and how God responds to you. And that is something humans need to learn. They need to know about, because it's not at all obvious how an invisible spirit will respond and be in contact. The story about prayer and practice is something that I've seen through many, many iterations of work with religion, with Christians, with people practicing Santeria, with people practicing magic, that people would say, first of all, they would say that if you want to understand this, this is not about a bunch of beliefs. They didn't put it like that. But if you want to understand this, this is about doing it. And doing it takes practice. Practice is hard. So everybody can learn to practice a little bit and experience something, but some people are better than others. And so over the years, I have identified a measure of proclivity. Some people are better than others. People who score highly on the absorption scale, regardless of their faith, regardless of their country, are more likely to report that they have vivid experiences of gods and spirits. They're more likely to feel that God is a person with whom they're in a relationship. They're more likely to say God has spoken back. They're more likely to say that they've seen the wingtip of an angel. They're more likely to say that they've felt power course through their body, a whole range of things. So what is absorption? The stupid answer is that it's a scale of 35 items created to measure hypnotizability by a guy called Auki Tellegen. It's got a low correlation with hypnotizability, which is the measure of whether you can get into a hypnotic state. I've been doing a chunk of work with this scale. I've worked with it for 30 years. My own point of view, supported by a mathematical statistical analysis of how the items hang together, is that it picks up first whether you like to be immersed in your inner and outer sensory worlds, and second, whether you're comfortable suspending disbelief. So the items are things like this. Sometimes I feel and experience things the way I did as a child. Sometimes I can turn noise into music by the way that I listen to it. Sometimes when I'm watching a play or a movie, I lose track of the fact that it's only a play, and I feel like it's really happening to me. There's synesthesia items. There's an item that says, sometimes I experience the things as if it's, and as if they're doubly real. So that's proclivity, something I see repeatedly in group after group. The more true somebody writes on the scale, the more likely they are to have these vivid experiences. And these two factors, vivid mental imagery and an interest in vivid inner and outer energy and imagery, and an interest in a willingness to suspend disbelief. Practice. So I bluntly and, naively am willing to say that there are some basic features of spiritual practice in many, many traditions. Certainly, and we could talk a little bit about the deep details about different kinds of spiritual practice. But I actually think that there are 2 or 3 features of an awful lot of spiritual practice. And the spiritual practice that I'm interested in is not so much the pure Zen and really American Zen practice where you're emptying your mind, where you're trying to empty your mind, but the practice in which you are focusing on something in particular. So on a god or on mandala or on you're making an invisible friend. And in these practices, in prayer, certainly evangelical Christian prayer, but also in deity yoga and in Tulpamancy and in Santeria and in Kabbalah, people kind of do 2 things. There's a background thing they do, which that they're doing this for a reason. They hope that to have some kind of connection or contact or experience or something. The 2 things they do are the 2 things that I think are central to absorption. There's the sinking into, in this case, mental imagery. So seeing the goddess Tara as clearly and precisely and as vividly as you can in your mind's eye, maybe looking at the pieces of the image, or in a practice called tulpamancy, where people kind of lean onto the Tibetan practice, but they don't have metaphysical commitments, but they're trying to invent invisible friends. They have an image of the friend they want to invent, like a fox, and they see that fox in their mind's eye. They look at the nose, they look at the tail, they touch the fur, all in their mind's eye. And one of the things we see is that changes their experience of mental imagery. It becomes more vivid. The other thing they do is what you could describe as narrative practice, could describe it as an as-if engagement. You could describe it as pretend. They talk to this imagined being as if the imagined being is there. So you see this a lot in Christian churches, evangelical churches. Pastor will say, talk to God as if he's there, even if you don't believe him. And soon he will be there. He will be. That's, you could say that Blaise Pascal said that as well. So there's something like proclivity, skill, something like practice. What I see also is that people in particular who think of their mind in a particular way are more likely to have these experiences. And the more people sort of imagine the mind world boundary as fixed and stuck, the fewer vivid experiences they have, the more they imagine that it's possible for thoughts to have force and to leave the mind, and other people's thoughts to have force, or maybe special people's thoughts to have force and enter the mind, the more vividly they experience gods and spirits. And I can give you a song and dance about why I think this is these intuitions come naturally to people, but cultures cultivate them or don't cultivate them. But we're really looking at what I would call porosity, the permeability between the mind and the world. And we can show that the more people commit to porous kinds of statements, the more vividly the immaterial will emerge for them. And what I see is that when people have these vivid experiences, particularly the really vivid experiences of gods and spirits, it matters because it can be hard to hang on to their realness. So if you've heard God speak to you, maybe in a voice that feels like it's not entirely your own, that really matters to you. If it can change your commitments. If you feel that God hugs you, you feel that the dead have called to you, have given you a message. You feel that Elagua spoke to you in a dream. All of those things really matter. They're not definitive, right? So some people they have a powerful experience and then they forget it and it goes away. Some people have one powerful experience and then the rest of their life they're chasing the power. Some people have a series of small, intimate experiences. I see that over time, people can. So, what I mean by kindling, I think there's a series of small acts of paying attention to in which people pay attention to in a way that's shaped by their social world, and that they grow this idea of something invisible, immaterial, spiritual, with whom they can be in relationship. And over time, it really does come to feel like a relationship. And it can be healthy for you, powerful for you. You use these ideas to guide your own spiritual practice. It can be kind of like psychotherapy. It does indeed can feel like dating an AI girlfriend. Some people do that. The tulpamancers look a little bit like that. But anyway, that's the kind of thing I was saying in the book.
That's wonderful, and it covers most of my questions. And I have two more. If anyone has questions in the Stoa, feel free to pop in the chat. We'll get to you in a moment. You had a disclaimer at the beginning of the book saying that this is not an atheist book, it's not a believer's book, it's an anthropologist book. Nothing I say here speaks for or against the genuine reality of gods and spirits. That being said, I'm curious if you're comfortable sharing, what is your personal view on the ontological status of invisible others? Do you see them as real? And one needs to get skilled at what Sean Hargens, the previous guest, called contact modalities, like such as prayer or like psychedelics or like Ouija board, something that you do to contact these ontologically real beings? Or are they like shared tulpas or egregores, like manifested thought forms made real via practice?
So I hesitate to give an answer to that question. I want to point out that there are two ways of thinking about it, and that William James did a pretty good job of kind of summarizing a place where it's easy to live. There's one way to think about them to say that, well, there's this extra immaterial substance. It's like you've got an extra room in your house and you've got this spirit who's there, and it's real or it's not real. Another way of thinking about it is that, well, we mostly misunderstand substance, ordinary substance in our world, that somehow it's more alive, it's more present, there's more animacy than we give it credit for. William James said, there are a lot of different religions, and it's hard to dismiss the experiences people have as being just accidents. Like he called that medical materialism. And he said, really, I'm going to say that there's more. That however you're thinking about the world, there's probably more. And we don't understand them more. And there are a lot of what he called overbeliefs, which is a pretty sweeping claim. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, each social world has a set of overbeliefs, set of ideas to organize their ideas about spirit. And that's fine, he says. Helps humans think. But and we it's hard to have a confident sense of the relationship of the overbelief to what's more. But he didn't want to give up on the more. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to think.
I love that phrase overbelief. And so my last question would be, or maybe one of my last questions would be on uh, malicious entities. So we're doing this series right now at the Stoa called the Entity Pill, and we're talking about we're using the catch-all phrase disincarnate entities, which is popular in psychedelic and shamanic circles, and it's often kind of focused on the malicious entities, demons, jinn, dubuks in the traditional sense. We're also looking at it from various modern perspectives. So people post-rational circles, they call them intersubjective parasites. People from the therapeutic modality, internal family systems, calls them critters or unattached burdens, and they have like modern practices in order to respond to them. They're basically non-physical entities that, at extreme case, can possess people, or at least that's the argument or claim. And I've had pretty intense personal experiences myself, and that just felt demonic. And many people have shared with me their stories as well. Um, and it seems like with these malicious demons or these experiences, or what do you want to call them, there's no conscious commitment to bring them about. There's no like conscious practice to make them real. They just come. And then it's just like a lot, often people turn Christian or move towards some kind of spiritual practice after encountering these things. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the malicious entities and these types of experiences.
So I, you know, I'm not going to go there ontologically. I feel less confident about that. It's certainly the case that demons, something that humans have called demons, is pretty robust over the course of human history. Lots of people report something like this. And I feel that we're about to be interrupted by doggy camp, but I will keep talking until the handlers show up. So it's, there's however one imagines the divine, the supernatural, the spiritual, there's a human relationship with that. There is and the humans experience that through the stuff of their own awareness. So they're representing. Sorry, I'm hoping Zoom is masking some of this. They're representing, they are interpreting, they feel something and they identify, and somehow they identify what they feel. So, hold on.
And while Tanya's taking care of the dogs, feel free to pop your question in the chat.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So what do I know about the human side of the relationship that's associated with negative stuff? So people in the sciencey world will argue about whether there are different kinds of human vulnerabilities to negative voices, negative visions, negative feelings. I'm involved with some of those arguments. I think I think that there is a distinction between the skill set and the psychological capacity that gets trained in prayer, and some of these experiences that get identified as psychotic. I think it's a different kind of human phenomenon. I do think that there is evidence that for some people, using prayer-like practices or these spiritual practices that are found around the world, that they can, for some people, mitigate, manage, and reframe the negative stuff. I mean, obviously, human life is not, lots of rain falls into lives. So it's not unreasonable to imagine that the more is messy.
Mm-hmm.
but it's certainly not unreasonable to imagine that human experience vivid things appears across a range of vulnerabilities, and these practices can be helpful. They can also be dangerous. So Vipassana meditation is kind of famously can make people vulnerable to psychosis.
Mm. Yeah, at my age, like just like how conscious practices could lead to real making and kindling for benevolent, invisible others. I wonder if unconscious practices or bad habits could lead to the same thing for malicious, invisible others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'll take in Robert Faulkner, just so you know, Tanya, he wrote this book, The Others Within Us. He's one of the leading,
Yeah, no, I know it.
oh yeah, family internal systems, and he's been following into the series throughout. So Robert, I'll take you in for the first question.
Thank you. It's great to be live with you, Dr. Luhrmann. You're one of my intellectual heroes.
That's so sweet of you. Thank you.
And years ago, you helped me find some research assistants that went into making that book. Wow. The citadel model of mind, which you haven't mentioned explicitly today, do you have to deal with your dogs now? Or this idea that, you know, we're this buffered, isolated thing, the opposite of porosity. I have come to believe that this is like a fundamental cause of most of our epidemic of mental illness. And there's a woman in England, Isabel Clarke, who's a psychologist who works with psychosis, who developed a theory called the billiard ball theory of mind, which is almost exactly like yours, but she doesn't seem to refer to you at all. And she views this as a real problem. It's why we get such bad results with psychosis. What do you think about the cultural impact and the general impact of the citadel model of mind in the West?
So, for those who haven't encountered that term, by citadel model of mind, I mean a a cultural understanding of mental events. So humans distinguish mentally stuff from bodily stuff. It's a pretty basic thing that we do everywhere in the world. We just do it in different ways in different parts of the world. And I think that in the West, broadly speaking, this is kind of Charles Taylor land for those of you who are philosophers. There's in the West, people highly valorize mental experience and their own self, their sense of identity, who I am, what I think, what my needs are. And by citadel, I mean that it's like really important, but somehow separated from the body. That if you think of the town as sort of the body, people just imagine mind as being very distinct. So I do think that what I see in my work with people with psychosis is that, and I've talked to people with psychosis in 5 parts of the world, more than that at this point, 6 or 7, is that it's the Americans, well, folks with the psychosis and also folks trying to connect to God. Folks trying to connect to God will have a vivid experience of God, and the Americans will say, you are going to think that this is crazy. That framing and that fear tends to be much more common in my experience with the folks in California and Chicago that I've spoken with. People with psychosis who, we know that people who fall into that diagnostic bucket, for want of a better term, people who meet criteria for schizophrenia, many of those people have vivid experiences of voices. They feel their messages that are bombarding them. And I am struck that in my small number comparisons with people in different settings, the American experience is much more violent. The voices are much more likely to give violent commands. People are more likely to experience them as alien experiences. I think that along with the, you could say, well, we live in America is just a more violent culture. And I think there may be something to that. But I also think that people are just terrified of losing their mind in a way that is culturally particular. I'm struck by that. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah. Could I have a follow-up? Could I sneak in one more? Great.
Sure.
I'm a psychotherapist primarily, so I come at this data from a very, very different angle. Somehow I started doing some of this, and then all these other psychotherapists referred cases that looked like possession to me because they didn't want to touch it. It's like the third rail of psychotherapy land. You do not do. And what resources, what other things what other people are doing research now that could be helpful to someone who's trying to use this information to help in healing suffering humans right in front of them?
I mean, I think that's more of a question for you than for me. So, I mean, I am struck that in general, when we compare experience across the world, possession tends to happen in places where people are culturally ready for possession. There are ideas about possession. And I'm wondering whether you are describing a phenomenon that's become more popular and more frequent in America now that I don't understand, which is somehow the experience of being possessed by a negative entity. I mean, you're making me wonder whether there's a new cultural comfort with that kind of idea. It's an interesting question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Khalil, you had a follow-up question.
Oh, hi. Sorry, 1 second. Hi, Tanya.
Hi.
I'm discovering you for the first time right now. This is so fascinating to me. So thank you, Peter, for inviting me to this session to join. I was wondering if you have a theory of the origin of these mental structures with different levels of ferocity. Like if you have like, for example, in media theory, for example, they would say like, oh, literacy tends to kind of constrict the ego and people focus on a kind of linear progression of things. And I'm wondering if you have a theory about how these structures, like the citadel structure, originates. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I think it's a really good question. I think that as humans develop, they develop the idea that in general, so in general, humans distinguish between mental stuff and bodily stuff or physical stuff or non-mental stuff. They discover at a certain point that other people have minds, that they have hidden invisible states that the outsider can't see. And that is, that you have to ask people, you have to get people to verbalize, or you infer what's going on in that state. So I think that there's a lot of evidence that humans in general, as they shift from very small to larger, develop what you could call a default model of mind. Okay, now I think the puppies are showing up. Or the camp is showing up. So in general, I think that there is the emergence of a default theory of mind in which mental stuff is internal, located in your body. It's yours. William James said that the most characteristic quality of thought was its minus. And the thought doesn't do stuff. It doesn't sort of slip out of your mind and sit on a puddle on the floor for somebody else to step in. I think that's what as sort of a default expectation of how the world works. And I do apologize for the noise. I hope it's Zoom masks a lot of it, so that's good. Okay, that is how I think humans generally expect to experience thought. But even very secular humans have thought experiences that don't fit well in that model. Powerful dreams are the best example. Excellent. Powerful dreams. Many people have dreams that feel as if they convey information from outside. Many people, and that doesn't, you can't square that with your default model of mind. Many people, when they feel anger, they have moments, not all anger, but there are moments of intense anger that just come through you, and that doesn't quite feel like yours. Then it doesn't feel like it quite disappears. So people, some people very easily have the idea that after a terrible fight, it can sort of feel as if the anger lingers on the air, or it can be really uncomfortable, the idea of sleeping in the bed where somebody has died a horrible death. That feels uncomfortable, and that's shouldn't make any sense. So I think there are what I would call conflicting intuitions, that we think about thoughts as private, as inside, as ours, as not as sort of not potent in the world. But we experience thought in so many different kinds of mental things that it's just easy to have the intuition, even if you don't believe in it. It kind of feels like the poem came to you. It feels as if, maybe those aren't your words, but they came to you from the outside. Maybe that wasn't really your anger, but it came to you from the outside. And maybe your anger can act in the world in a way that really kind of affects something. So that's the way that's the theoretical model that I would use to make sense of this.
Any follow-up, share or question, Cleo?
I'll just say, no, thank you. That was great. I'll just say that if you're trying to revive animacy, you're going to have to teach us how to use it responsibly. So keep that in mind.
Thank you.
All right, Sarah, you had a question.
I'm actually going to move. Hold on. I will. Sorry about that. I'm back.
Okay. Hi, Tanya.
Hi.
My question is around belief. So what I asked was, what's the relationship between belief, or at least an open-mindedness that it's possible to have a relationship with a being, and success in that endeavor?
So it takes effort and work. I am struck by the fact that for many people, it can be a deeply satisfying experience, but not for all. And I sort of think of this in part as being lucky at your choice of a being. So, lucky because some people can have a representation of a god, and they don't really know that they're tucking into that imagination some sort of negative features they didn't anticipate. Your best model for a caring male figure is your dad. But maybe your dad had some complicated characteristics you're not really thinking of when you kind of model your god upon that. But what I've seen with Christians is that they are working within a community, and they are, as they develop their God experience, they are as they're developing their God experience, they are doing so within a community of others who are advising them, commenting on them. No, that doesn't sound like God to me. Yes, that does sound like God. And the community can be helpful. People say that about taking ayahuasca, that if you take ayahuasca on your own, you are vulnerable to all kinds of not so evident ideas that you have about the experience. By not so evident, it might mean unconscious fears and fantasies that you're not allowing yourself to recognize. But if you take ayahuasca in a group, and and again, you need to be lucky in the group, and the group gives you advice and helps you to manage, that can be a more helpful experience.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
If you were to if two people, say in a church, were both to engage in, the two things that you said were the primary pieces, which is one, sinking into mental imagery, and two, narrative practice or engagement or pretending that they're there. If there was a difference in levels of belief, like let's say one person believed and wanted it, so belief and desire, and one person maybe is not sure they believe and is being told to do it. I mean, that's too many variables, but is there a difference? Like when someone has a belief and a desire, or when someone doing it because they're part of a group that expects them to do it?
So, yeah, I mean, belief and desire tend to make an experience more vivid and more accessible. You're going to do more of this real making work in order to come to have a vivid engagement with the presence of a God. It's, at the evangelical church I was spending time, people often talked about people being church wounded and God wounded. And what they meant by that was that there are people who around them whose understanding, representation of God was not so helpful. And that can really happen to people. I mean, I am struck by the fact that when evangelicals, there's a world of evangelical Christians who grow up in the church, and then at a certain point, they decide that this is not for them. But that by that point, they've had such a vivid and visceral experience with God that it kind of feels like they've swallowed a snake. They decide they're going to leave the church because they feel that this is not, they have different ideas about their body or about sex or about politics, and they want to take off. But the God that they're involved with really is pretty harsh and critical. And they imagine that this God rejects them, and they don't believe in the God, but they've helped to make the God feel real to themselves, and that can be tough.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I do shamanic healing work with an Andean tradition, and one of the things, I'm very new, so I don't have years. I have about 1.5 years of practice. But one of the things I've noticed is a belief wound. So I've been calling it an injury to belief, but I think it's parallel to that God wound or church wound. Is like something injured their ability to believe in anything, even whether it's spiritual or not. And so they're sort of limping along from that point on. So
yeah, it can be really tough.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll see if we can have 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to read Guy's question on his behalf. What's been the story which most pushed you towards thinking of entities as ontologically real, if any?
It's I think for me, the most powerful experiences came when I was a bit younger, and they were just I mean, it's going to sound ridiculous, but I was in my room at college at Cambridge, and I was in a special room that had belonged to somebody in the guy who had founded my college in America. Yeah, this is going to sound crazy. And I was thinking about leaving the room. It was the end of the year, and out of the blue, his portrait fell off the wall. And just a silly coincidence, but it was it's never left me, that I was having an emotional experience and something happened that seemed to suggest a response.
Fascinating. John, you had a question, perhaps follow up to that.
Yeah, I have two curiosities. They're kind of distinct from one another, but I want to start off with when you were saying maybe not your anger, but it came from the outside. I kind of made an association of people who would call themselves empaths or people who are sensitive to the field and whatnot.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about just my own imagination of sometimes can these energies enter into the sensitive people, and what is your thoughts and understanding of like how do these energies get processed through, and can there be a conscious way of like if a person is sensitive, I know of like there's ways to protect, like create shields, but is there ways to like really go in and like is there like studies or kinds of like understandings of that person processing the shadow of the group field and allowing something to happen in their body. And it's another thing that's like coming as an association to that is like this also like our shadows process through the dissipation effect, and is the communication of something in the field also another way of processing such a thing. Um, yeah, that might be here and there, but yeah, that's what one of the curiosities that came up.
So is the curiosity how people deal with negative entities?
Not, it could be any energies. Um, how people who are sensitive or who may call themselves an empath uh, can deal with energies that may not be their own, quote unquote.
So I, I think that what I see is the what I know about is the way people do practices. And so there are practices. I mean, there's a famous book called Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune that describes this kind of set of practices of how people shield themselves, how people discern these spirits. So yeah, it does sound like one of the key questions is this discernment of what's happening, and then a decision of how to manage.
Any follow-up share question, John?
I guess this is the other thing, the other curiosity. So one thing that I noted immediately when you started speaking was I just said like, oh, I like her voice. And
Thank you very much.
and it just gets me curious about like, is your practice with the invisible others, has that influenced, how has that influenced the way that you are in this world, the way that you relate with all like people in your lives, uh, with everything? How what have you seen from this connection to the spirit world or these more benevolent invisible others?
So that's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that question. But I do think that I have a broader range of tolerance for people's experience than some folks. And I think that's, I don't know. But it's a good question. It's hard to get a fish to talk about their water.
Very cool. I like your voice too, Tanya, for the record. Yeah, I think it will be good to gently close here. Any parting words or thoughts you'd like to share with us?
No, I'm just curious about this as a community. So I'd love to learn a little bit more. You have good questions. You clearly are all on, you know, you might all count as the spiritual, but not religious. Would that be fair? It's and that's just a really interesting place to be in modern America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can send you some links after, especially on the series that we're exploring here, which I think you might appreciate given the diversity of perspectives we're looking at. But yeah, definitely check out Tanya's book, How God Becomes Real. It's brilliant. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Tanya, thanks so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thank you so much. So I'll take off now.
Right,
Is
take
that
care.
right? Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tanya. Bye. And yeah, our last session in the this interview series, I'm tempted to say thank God, is on unseen warfare. So from Orthodox Christian perspective, this is the guy who did the Death to the World zine, that famous Death to the World punk rock Orthodox zine. So you can check that out. It's next week, I think Wednesday at 12. And then the following Saturday, we're having our final kind of collective inquiry. And then people in this cohort are going to do mini presentations on their perspective, their experience, some maybe tips or insights that they had. So we're going to do like rapid fire lightning presentation talks. So if you have one, let me know, but definitely come check that out. So yeah, that being said, everyone, thanks so much for coming to Stoa today.